Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event on Impeachment and American History, a book published by Random House just a few short months ago. My name is Thomas DiPiero, and I am the Dean of the Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences here at SMU, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Center for Presidential History, and I'm very pleased to announce that just recently the center was moved into Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences. We're very pleased to welcome them here because they complement the research and teaching mission of the university so well. The Center for Presidential History promotes the study of the U.S. presidency, and it does so through its teaching and research, through public outreach events such as this one, and also through its Collective Memory Project, which is an oral history run by staff on the center who film and record archives of people who have been in various administrations, as well as local officials who worked closely with those administrations. The center also runs a very robust postdoctoral fellowship program. It's been in effect for about 5 years, and it's rapidly become probably the most influential and famous fellowship program in this area of its kind. Each of the fellows who completes their term as fellows has published a book or contracted a book at a major university press, such as Harvard, Princeton, or Cornell, and they all get jobs, and that's a good thing, so we're very proud of them. The Center for Presidential History tremendously complements the work we do in Dedman College. In addition to the work they do in their own teaching and research, they complement the Department of History as well as the Clements Center for Southwest Studies. And you'll be pleased to know, because I know there's a lot of history buffs here, we are bucking the national trend here at SMU. We're getting more and more students studying history and becoming history majors, and that's a great thing. I know many of you have been to some of the center's events such as this before, and we're thrilled. There have been over 100 events in the past 6 years, and as you all know, these are free of charge. We would like to have seen more people here. We have a very big waiting list for this event. So one of the things we're going to be doing in the very near future is roll out a donors event, a special set of possibilities and events for people who choose to support the center. There will be special lectures for these people. There will be luncheons, there will be events, and you'll have the opportunity to support students who want to study abroad on the center's program. They take a study abroad program. They do D-Day in Britain and France, and not all students can afford to pay for this, so we're hoping we'll get support so more students can take this fantastic program. I'd like to introduce our panelists. By the way, before I forget, this event tonight is co-sponsored by the John Goodwin Tower Center for Political Studies, and we're also in collaboration with the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, President Jim Falk. I also want to call out the editor of the project who is here with us tonight. That's Molly Turpin. Molly, are you here? Give us a wave.
Molly.
There you are, Molly.
Yeah.
Our contributors on the panel tonight are Peter Baker, who is the chief White House correspondent of the New York Times.
Woo!
Timothy Naftali, who teaches at NYU and is a frequent contributor to CNN.
Trying to help you out here. Oh, sorry.
John Meacham is a Pulitzer Prize winning and New York Times best-selling historian. And our own Jeffrey Engel, who is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History, and just this month, he was named the 2019 SMU Faculty Member of the Year by the students in residence life.
Oh, that's big.
I had to pay them a lot.
I was going to say, great. Is there a recount?
Tonight's event is moderated by someone who all of you in Dallas know. You've heard her voice many, many times, ask some of the most penetrating questions I have ever heard. Chris Boyd, who is the host and producer of KAR's fabulous program. Thank you.
Just want to remind everybody that I have an iPad here because we are accepting questions from the audience, but we're going to take them via Twitter. So they'll filter into me as they come through, and the tweet, you can tweet at CPH at SMU, CPH, Center for Presidential History at SMU, if you've got a question. All right, gentlemen, welcome this evening.
Hi.
Jeffrey, I want to start with you. The most obvious question is the one that I know you like the least. And that is, what did the framers intend when they created a provision for impeachment?
They intended a fail-safe. in case there was ever an opportunity or a problem that a president were to have office and it were discovered that that president was damaging the country in some way. Not, and this is critical, I haven't said anything funny yet. Not, and this is critical, not a president who was just bad at his job. In fact, the term that they used and then discarded was maladministration. That if a president was simply incompetent or bad or had bad policies, the voters would take care of that. What they really were concerned about was a president who was doing something that would damage the country in some way, which is really why they come up with this wonderful phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, which all of them completely understood. We don't, but they did. But I think it's actually really obvious if you go back and think about what they thought about that term. A high crime is a crime against the state, something that hurts the body politic, which means something which is not necessarily a legal crime, but something which hurts the people. That's when you know that somebody should be removed from office. And of course, they wanted it to be a high bar, so they made it very difficult through the congressional process. But they did want the opportunity to make sure that if it was discovered a president was dangerous, that he or she could be removed.
They had direct memories of living under tyranny.
Yeah, they just fought a revolution against tyranny. In fact, even going back further in British history, they really had a sense that some sovereigns were helpful and some sovereigns were not. In fact, I think they really were driven in many ways during the revolutionary period by a real Lockean notion of what made a sovereign or a government good. And that simply was one that took care of the people. And a sovereign that put himself above the people, or in worst cases, put himself at war with the people, did not take care of the people's needs, which is how the colonialists or colonists thought of themselves vis-a-vis the British king, of course, which was the instigator for the revolution. That was a sovereign that should be discarded. So when they thought about an executive, when they thought about a president that could be so powerful that he could go off the rails in some way, they had a lot of historical reason to fear this because they themselves had just gone away from a sovereign, an executive, who had, in their minds, put himself at war against the American people.
When they were setting up these rules and making these decisions, there were people who had to be convinced that something like impeachment should be included in the Constitution. What were the arguments against it?
Well, the arguments against it are actually really fascinating because, as I said before, they wanted to dispense with the idea that we could get rid of a president simply for maladministration. But they also realized that any time that you give Congress one of the competing branches of government, and we all know that the government was set up in a sense to fight against each other, to compete for power against each other. If you gave Congress the opportunity in any way, shape, or form to say, we have, no pun intended, a trump card over the presidency, that we are able to remove the president when we see fit, that's a really dangerous idea because, you know, in essence, if it just takes Congress agreeing that a president should be impeached to impeach him, well, that means that Congress in some ways could ultimately reign supreme over the presidency, and that, of course, is not the situation that they wanted as a balance of power. Now, I do have to say, when we talk about this entire framework of a fear of executive power, that's really a more modern notion in many ways than the founders had, which is to say the people at the Constitutional Convention were actually more concerned and spent more time talking about a tyrannical Congress. That Congress was the ones that you really needed to watch out for because they presumed the president would be somewhat limited by the Congress, but they had a lot of experience, especially with the state legislatures, with Congresses that simply had run amok over the executive. So they wanted to make sure that the impeachment was possible, but very difficult.
John, in the best of circumstances, Abraham Lincoln is an impossible act to follow. Andrew Johnson was really no Abraham Lincoln. Why were the
I knew Abraham Lincoln. It's the one state in the Union where you can make that joke.
Why initially were Republicans optimistic about the chances that Johnson would do what they wanted?
Well, there was a moment. Remember, Andrew Johnson is, I have to quickly say, I'm a Tennessean, so you all can thank me later for your independence as a state. If it weren't for us, y'all would still be part of Spain. And I made that joke to George W. Bush the first time I met him, Peter's great subject. And he was governor then. And I saw him at the governor's mansion. I said this, and he went, "That's pretty funny, asshole." It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
I need, my mother's in the crowd.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Ms. Ziegler, how are you? Aren't we proud of our boy? This is great. He said maladministration twice and Lockean. Get a 12 years of graduate school, you get Lockean. Sorry, what was the question? No. Andrew Johnson was, and I'm just going to jump in here. We've only used his name as a verb as an adjective, but Voldemort, we might as well just go ahead and call him that. I think this moment is most like the Johnson one, where Johnson was a temperamentally erratic, non-traditional politician in that he did not have a natural political base in Washington. Johnson was from Tennessee. He was a Democrat. He'd been put on the ticket in 1864 to balance out in the border states. He was not a Republican. And so for the Republican Party to have him come to power that terrible Easter weekend in 1865 was shocking, a shock upon shocks. The impeachment unfolded because of an existential disagreement about what the verdict of the Civil War actually meant. It was a significant policy difference. And they went in search of a pretext on which to impeach him. It's kind of remarkable when you think about it that it took, 80 years from almost exactly from Philadelphia to the impeachment, for impeachment to be used as a political tool. I think it speaks well of the system that it was in fact this existential question. Remember, Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Acts, he vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Act, he opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments. Not a lot of revision or work to do on Johnson. I mean, there's not much there to admire. He believed that Congress was in a conspiracy against him. He denounced fake news. He didn't have very good hair. I mean, the whole thing kind of resonates. So in many ways, what I think the Johnson story tells us is that impeachment as a weapon of politics is very, very hard to execute. But at least, and I think this separates my guy from Tim and Peter's, Johnson was embroiled in a fundamental argument about the nature of the country. And Nixon had if I'm jumping on Tim's thing, Nixon had committed crimes. Peter's guy was it was a cultural clash in many ways. Johnson was the most serious debate because here was someone from the defeated region at the cockpit of power trying to undo the verdict of the battlefield. And in their frustration, the Republicans lashed out using the mechanics of impeachment.
So he was impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act. First of all, very briefly, what was that?
God,
Briefly.
Jesus, if I know. It is hopeless. David Stewart, a colleague of ours, who's a lawyer and a historian, sounds like the beginning of a joke, right? There's one parachute, lawyer, historian. He never figured it out. He wrote a whole book trying to figure it out. It was an attempt to curtail Johnson's capacity to remove Lincoln's cabinet. So it was basically about Edwin Stanton and keeping the Lincoln officials in power. The Republican Congress worried that Johnson was going to clean house and bring in people to support this reactionary vision of what the country could be. And remember, 750,000 Americans, which is now the number we pretty much agree on, had died fighting amid what Lincoln called the fiery trial. It was the ratifying struggle of the American experiment. And then by a constitutional and political happenstance, a president is in power who wants to undo that. And so in the ferocity and chaos of that political moment, impeachment was what they settled on.
And how did Johnson survive?
Bribery, mostly. Honestly, I mean, it's a little mixed. What's the old story about? Was it Curley in Boston?
Yep.
Who said, "Never say what you cannot. Never write down what you can. Never write down what you can say, and never say what you can gesture." That was kind of the story. There was a lot of money flying around in the conviction trial, and there's, frankly, President Kennedy, whom Tim is writing about, wrote a very uplifting and totally wrong chapter in Profiles in Courage about the deciding vote, Edmund Ross, in the impeachment and the conviction trial. I don't know if you agree with this, but basically the backstory there is Kennedy was under extraordinary political pressure because he had managed to avoid voting to censure Joe McCarthy. He was in the hospital. He was always in the hospital. But he didn't even pair up his vote, and he realized that this had alienated the northern wing of the party. And he needed something to sort of clean up his national reputation as he went into the 1960 campaign. He wrote Profiles in Courage. If you're going to find Profiles in Courage, be good to find one in the South if you're a Democrat, and a Southern hero, and that was the profile, as if there was some great principled stand here. It was really about not wanting impeachment to be used, as Jeff was saying, too often. But basically, Johnson bought his way to survival.
All right, Tim, you said that Nixon's impeachment began not with the break-in at the Watergate, but with the Saturday Night Massacre. That was what pushed the country over a psychological line. Talk about that.
Before I get to that, I think that John F. Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage to be the vice president.
Oh.
And he wanted to be the northerner liked by the South. He saw himself as because he was not fully committed to civil rights when he was running for vice president. So that's why when you read about Johnson, he says some wacky things about Andrew Johnson. He almost writes as if he liked him.
Yeah.
So it, just as John said, it speaks extremely well of the country that it took 80 years for the country to go through its first impeachment crisis. It speaks even better of this country that it took over 100 years to have it a second time. And I think for those of us who are suffering from OCD, because every day there is a crisis. I mean, imagine what Peter has to do, right? Right?
Peter's a heroin dealer right now.
But a Berkeley
Well,
one.
and that's why we need the wall. No. Sorry. Now, no, but I want to make this point because if you're under a certain age, this will shock you, and if you're over a certain age, you've forgotten. Richard Nixon, Nixon's trouble started in the summer of '72, but it takes 16 months for a Congress dominated by Democrats to begin impeachment hearings. Now, you got to wonder, wait a second, given the nature of our political moment, 16 months. Well, part of the reason is John's guy, which is the lesson that the Washington community learned about impeachment from the Johnson era, was you don't do it. Okay, it's anti-democratic. It's traumatic for the country. It's traumatic for members of Congress. It's not the way to deal with a bad president. In the case of Andrew Johnson, they're doing it the year of an election year. I mean, they could have waited a few more months, and ultimately he's obviously not reelected. In the case of Nixon, it's Nixon who pushes the Washington community and many Americans over a psychological edge, and he does that when he fires Archibald Cox. He does that when he forces the Justice Department to fire Archibald Cox, and the Attorney General says no, and the Deputy Attorney General says no, and then this Yale scholar who happened to be Solicitor General, Robert Bork, who, by the way, I interviewed for the Nixon Library. You can watch that interview. He didn't want to do it either, but he felt that the president had the authority under Article 2 to do it, and he fired Archibald Cox. And that raised a question of President Nixon's legitimacy, not just for partisans. And that's, I think, the key part of the story that interested me, because we've got a lot of writing about Nixon. And when Jeff asked us to do this book together, the story I wanted to understand, because of the current political moment we live in, was everybody partisan in 1974? And why was it that Republicans voted against Richard Nixon? And that's the story. That's what interests me, because we all have to wonder sometimes, can we be bipartisan, let alone nonpartisan? And the Nixon story is phenomenally interesting because Nixon pushed Republicans over the edge by his misconduct.
The Nixon affair raised questions as to whether a sitting president could be indicted for obstruction of justice. Has that question been resolved?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, and I try very hard not to be one on TV. But I can tell you the story of how that was looked at in the Nixon period. And I have the story from Archibald Cox's number 2, Henry Ruth, and from some memoirs that have been published. The members of the special committee staff, the Watergate special prosecution staff, all agreed that the president could be indicted, with one exception. The special prosecutor himself from the great state of Texas, Leon Jaworski, disagreed. Now, Leon Jaworski, the reasons why he disagreed vary depending on who you ask. But it seems clear that Leon Jaworski decided not to litigate the issue because the impeachment proceedings had already started. Leon Jaworski replaces Archibald Cox. So Leon Jaworski himself just didn't want to deal with the issue and decided, let's not deal with the issue. We'll just let Congress manage it. And after Congress decides what to do with Nixon, if he's a private citizen, we can indict him. What I can tell you for a fact is that you had this extraordinary moment in American history when the judge that was overseeing the grand jury responsible for indictments and his law clerk, the judge is John J. Sirica, he's no longer with us, but his law clerk is with us, and the special prosecutor all listened to the famous Cancer on the Presidency conversation and concluded by January of '74 that Richard Nixon was a criminal and that he should go to jail. The problem was there was no procedure by which you could do anything with that knowledge. Because as Jeff describes brilliantly in his section, committing a crime is not a sufficient cause for impeachment. So the problem was, how do you get information about the fact that Richard Nixon was a criminal? By the way, Judge Sirica was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower. He was no Democratic partisan. And Leon Jaworski was a Democrat, but a conservative Democrat. In fact, that's why the Nixon White House chose him. They both concluded Nixon was a crook. And the problem was, how do you get that information to the House? And one of the weaknesses in the constitutional approach to impeachment is it is not clear that a criminal president doesn't have enough power to prevent evidence that would prove him to be criminal to get to the House. So you have in a sense, the Constitution rests on the assumption that either the data you need to make this judgment is available to everyone, or that the president will willingly hand it over. And the problem here was that Richard Nixon was engaging in an active cover-up and obstruction of justice. The tape they heard, they got because Nixon wanted to stave off impeachment right after the Saturday Night Massacre, and he turned over the 8 tapes that had been requested, but there were many, many more, including the famous smoking gun conversation. So The problem for these independently minded, nonpartisan people was, how do you get this information to the Congress? And I had never wondered about this problem. And to a certain extent, this is a problem we will always face when we have a criminal president. By the way, presidents are innocent until proven guilty. But just imagine if a president were criminal, knowingly criminal. Think of all the tools they have at their disposal to prevent that information from getting to Congress. There is nothing in the Constitution that forces their hand. Sorry, that's a little depressing.
What did it take to get Republicans to align against Nixon?
You know, there are I think John F. Kennedy's book, and I'm writing about him as president. Profiles in Courage, as John said, is not a great book. You could write a wonderful story, however, about the profiles in courage of the Republicans and the Southern Democrats in the summer of 1974. These people decided that they felt Richard Nixon should be impeached. And they knew that their constituents didn't want it, and they knew that their base didn't want it. The president retained 30% support till the very end. But that doesn't tell you about support, because there's intensity of support. There was an intensity of support for him in the South. And there was an intensity of support for him in many, many Republican districts outside of in that era, there weren't many Republican districts in the South, but outside of the South. And so these people decided that their responsibility was to us as constitutional officers, that they were like grand jurors, and that their job was beyond party. They had a duty to consider whether this was a moment to use impeachment as one of them described, a safety valve. That the continued existence of a presidency would set a precedent that would undermine the rule of law and our constitutional order going forward. Because should that president survive through the end of his term, that is sending a signal to all future malefactors that you can get away with it in the United States. And the Republicans who came to this conclusion, and I know this because some of them kept diaries, which I read, decided that they had no choice, despite the fact that their constituents would not be happy, but to remove this man because he was a threat to our Constitution. And these men, there is a very important woman in the story, and this will surprise you. Her name was Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan wasn't sure she wasn't prepared to impeach Nixon. She was among those that was uncertain. She talked to these Republicans and Southern Democrats about this. Ultimately, she made her decision. She was not part of a small group that rewrote the articles of impeachment so that they were comfortable. But she didn't make up her mind until late in the process. She was no partisan. She felt the huge burden of making this decision rested on her shoulders, and she knew that as a constitutional officer, she owed it to the American people not to choose on party, but on principle. So she's a great story, and she's also a profile in courage. The rest of this group were men, and they were white, and they were from various parts of this country, and they weren't people we necessarily would like for other reasons. For example, one of them was George Wallace's campaign manager in the 1968 campaign. His name was Walter Flowers. I'm not sure we would like his views on a number of issues. But he decided that even though Richard Nixon was good for his cause, because Richard Nixon, he's the origin of the dog whistle, Richard Nixon was undermining the structure of this country. The others were one's from the Corn Belt, another was from Roanoke, Virginia, one was from rural Maine, one was from upstate New York. These are the real heroes of 1974. And one would hope that should we ever be in a similar presidency again, that those kinds of heroes are among us.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I haven't had a chance to ask Tim this. If he had destroyed the tapes, would he have finished his term?
Yes. There's no doubt in my mind he would have finished his term. Well, first of all...
So why didn't he?
Well, that's that's what makes. Well, this is really, really interesting and important about this era. Richard Nixon self-sabotaged, not because he wanted to leave office, as he said. I think leaving office before the end of my term is abhorrent to me, or something of that nature.
Every instinct in my body.
Thank you. I'm not going to do that anymore. I used to do that as the director privately. So I was the director of the Nixon Library when it became a federal institution. Richard Nixon was temperamentally ill-suited to be president, in that he was an introvert in an extrovert's job. And what he did not know, other than being sneaky and running a cover-up, which we know from the tapes he did, he actually was not very good at creating public sympathy for himself. He, unlike other presidents who've come under scrutiny, he actually withdrew from the public space. There wasn't any social media, but he was a near recluse in 1974. He used surrogates to get his story out, and his surrogates were not like certain surrogates in this era. They were not attack dogs. Richard Nixon was very sick with pneumonia. When Alexander Butterfield is he is the man who put the system, the taping system, in the White House at the request of the president and his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman. When Alexander Butterfield tells the staff of the Senate Watergate Committee about the taping system, he also tells White House lawyers that he's just done this. So White House has a little bit of notice before the public knows this. The president, it just so happens, is at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he's sick with pneumonia. And his lawyers and his chief of staff gather around his bed to discuss what to do. And
This is when?
this is July 1973. It is, you can't make this up, okay? And they're debating, and the president is getting all kinds of advice. Vice President Spiro Agnew, who's not yet had to resign for taking bribes when he was governor and then bribes when he was vice president, his advice is, burn him. John Connally, coming from a state that creates some of the best barbecue in the world, said, build a bonfire. The president's lawyer is worried about an obstruction of justice charge against himself as well as the president. Because, and the lawyers out there will know this is a challenge, if you know that something is going to be subpoenaed and you destroy it, you actually could be charged. I don't know whether a court will find you guilty, but you could be charged with obstruction of justice. So everybody in that room knew that these tapes would be subpoenaed. And his lawyer said, no. But it turns out that two things mattered most. One, the president's chief of staff, a man named Bob Haldeman, who is apparently, by some people, who's on a pedestal for being the most effective chief of staff in history. Believe me, he wasn't. He said, don't worry, Mr. President, the tapes will exonerate you. In what universe? In what universe? Well, it says a lot about Bob Haldeman. But Al Haig, and Al Haig is always a source of a good story. About 50% of them are true. I don't know which side this one falls in, but he told us at the Nixon Library. But Haig said, well, actually, when no one else was around, the president turned to me and said, would you destroy them, Al? And now keep in mind, we are talking about 4,000 hours of reel-to-reel tapes. This is not this. This is a room in the old executive office building. So think about the problem of destroying, okay? he says, "Will you destroy it?" Al Haig says, "I can't do that to my family. I can't do that. Get your valet to do it. Get Manolo to do it. You know, get some." And so the president may actually have considered doing it, but the logistics of destroying this many tapes were enormous. And in any case, he wasn't fully there. He wasn't well. So he's still in the hospital when Alexander Butterfield testifies. I am convinced that had the tapes been destroyed, everything else we've discussed, the special prosecutor wouldn't have been fired. You wouldn't have the grand jury, judge of the grand jury, concluding the president had engaged in obstruction of justice. The conversation that the judge listened to, where it all came clear to him, involved the president talking about hush money with John Dean. And when John Dean expected the president to say, "We can't do this," the president said, "How much will it cost?" And John Dean came up with a funny number. He said $1 million, which, you know, if you've seen Austin Powers, once was a lot of money. And instead of the president saying, "Oh my God, this is outrageous," he says, "Well, you know, we can find that." Well, you wouldn't have had that on tape. You would have then just had John Dean's word against Richard Nixon's. And when it's the word of a staffer who's facing imprisonment versus the president, the American people choose the president. So I think Nixon would have ended his term.
All right, let's talk about what happens when an extrovert in an extrovert's job finds himself facing impeachment. Peter, the point has been made that it was 80 years before the first impeachment, another century before the second. What are we to make of the fact that it was 25 years between Nixon's impeachment and Bill Clinton's?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, in fact, you had people who had been involved in the previous impeachment now engaged in that same issue. That didn't happen under Nixon. Nobody in the Nixon case had been involved in the Johnson impeachment. In this case, the First Lady herself had served on the staff of the House Judiciary Committee during the Nixon impeachment. She had drafted memos. She had been involved in legal research. She was personally involved. A lot of the other figures, in fact, Sam Dash becomes, from the Watergate prosecution, or the committee staff, becomes the ethics counsel to Ken Starr, who's pursuing President Clinton. Number of members of Congress who, of course, had served in 1974 were still there in 1998 and 1999. So this was not a distant memory for them. This was a real living event in the life of the country. And they were left to try to decide, based on the Watergate precedent and to some extent on the Johnson precedent, how do they treat the allegations against Bill Clinton. Now, for the most part, they tossed out the Johnson precedent because it was so long ago and circumstances were so different and it was seen as so political that they decided that it wasn't really that useful to them trying to figure out a roadmap. The Nixon thing was different. Nixon was, in fact, the model for what they did. In fact, when the House Judiciary Committee, all Republicans, majority at this time, as opposed to Democratic majority at that time, decided they were going to pursue articles of impeachment, they literally took the Nixon ones and cut and paste language into their own. The House Judiciary Committee chairman in the Watergate era was a man named Rodino. They used his name as the password for the computer when they were drafting the articles of impeachment in 1998. Rodino is what you typed into the computer to get them. So they were very consciously modeling what they were doing on Nixon. Now, of course, the problem is they're trying to fit a square peg into a circular hole, or vice versa, whatever. And they were trying to fit a different set of facts into what made Watergate unique. And in doing so, they tripped themselves up because then they set the standard that high. And the question is, could you meet that standard? Is everything short of Watergate not impeachable or not? And that was a question they couldn't answer to the satisfaction of the country, in effect. So you're right. Watergate was a very living memory. It shaded and affected the entire conversation through that 13 months.
I think a lot of Americans less informed than our audience here today think that Bill Clinton was impeached for having an affair with an intern.
Right, which is not true. And I understand why people think that. It was the proximate beginning of what led to the impeachment. Obviously, if he kept his pants on, everything would have been fine. He didn't do that.
That's a good lesson for all of us.
It's a good lesson for all of us. Yes. That's a different kind of maladministration, believe me. And it's... And you know, in fact, and the truth is he had warning, right? You know, when he ran, Jeff is now going to tell us at some point down the road what happened in 1992. He had warning in 1992 that the country had changed its view of a president's behavior. That you no longer were able to consider something to be a private life that was out of bounds, and we weren't going to talk about it. He had that with Jennifer Flowers. He had fair warning. We were paying attention. This was subject to scrutiny, whether it's fair or not. It was, and he couldn't help himself anyway. So he's this Shakespearean figure who couldn't control his own appetites, and that leads to the situation. But he was not impeached for having an affair. He was impeached for lying under oath and for obstruction of justice. He was required by a federal judge to answer questions in a deposition in a lawsuit brought by Paula Jones, who had been an Arkansas state employee who alleged that he sexually harassed her. He was required by the court to answer truthfully. He was required by the court not to try to obstruct her right to have a fair lawsuit. So, okay, let's just say for the sake of argument that he did these things, and we're not going to argue the fact. We're going to argue, you know, does that constitute a high crime misdemeanor? Because ultimately that's the question, right? And I always find the Clinton impeachment to be kind of this murky middle between the Johnson impeachment and the Nixon impeachment in this way. If the Johnson impeachment was basically a policy dispute wrapped up in the guise of a criminal high crime and misdemeanor controversy, and Nixon was a, you know, I think almost everybody would agree today, a very clear example of abuse of power and no question a no-brainer on the impeachment scale. Where does it leave us with Clinton? Right? If a president violates the law, let's just say for the sake of argument he did, okay? And by the way, he later admitted that he gave false testimony under oath. He had his law license suspended. He was found in contempt of court by the judge for lying under oath and so forth. So there is a documentary record that in fact he did commit what we would consider to be crimes. Is that enough to justify removal from office? And the difference between him and Nixon is that Nixon used the power of his presidency in the furtherance of his efforts then. And Clinton didn't, for the most part. I mean, you can make an argument. Truthfully, though, it was him, trying to hide his private behavior that was abhorrent in a circumstance where he was obligated to tell the truth. But he wasn't damaging the country, I think, in the way that Jeff was talking about in the broader sense. But does it damage the country if the person we trust with the ultimate power to take care the laws are enforced, which is what the Constitution tells us he's supposed to do, doesn't do that? What does that mean? Where is the line drawn? How do you have accountability for a president? And is there anything short of impeachment if we decide, well, this is a crime and it's abhorrent and we should not accept this, and yet we don't think he should be removed from office? 60% of the people think he's doing a good job, and we don't think it rises to that level.
How did he manage to flip the script publicly and have 60% of people thinking he was doing a good job and ought to remain in office?
It's a great question. Well, a couple of things. First of all, it turns out that lying works, okay? And I hate to say that. I hope bad lesson, okay? If my son is watching this at home, please don't listen to this because it's not true. But actually the truth is, because he lied for 7 months, between January 1998 and August of 1998, when he finally comes forward and semi-tells the truth that he'd had an affair with Monica Lewinsky, the country had come to terms with it by that point. They weren't shocked anymore. Everybody had either come to believe, in fact, of course he did. And the power of that had diminished to some extent. Had he admitted it right up front, it's very possible he might have been forced to resign. At least that's the conclusion he drew from it. And I think by the time it gets to Congress, the country had basically had 6, 8, 9 months of this, was kind of tired of it. The other thing is, we had a good economy. He was perceived to be a good president. We were not at war. And he did a very good job of what he called compartmentalizing, which is to tell the country, I'm concerned about your issues and let them deal with this muck. And I'm not dignifying that. Now, it was kind of a false front. You know, when he says, I'm not focused on that, I'm focused on your issues. The truth is he was obsessed and consumed by it. Of course he was, right? He goes to the Middle East at one point. He's in Gaza, and he's supposed to be negotiating, Middle East peace. And his aide looks over his shoulder and notices Clinton writing on his legal pad, focus on your job, focus on your job, focus on your job. Right? Of course this is going to consume him. But he gave the impression to the country that he was focused on his job. And he maintained that popular support. And the truth is, it is not a criminal proceeding. It is, in fact, a political proceeding, impeachment. And if you are a president who is popular, you're going to undercut the power of an impeachment effort against you because the country doesn't want you to be removed.
20 years on, we think in really different ways about the dalliances of powerful men. I wonder if Bill Clinton existed in this moment, could he have survived?
That's a great question, and there is no question that's sort of a Me Too reappraisal in some ways of Clinton at this moment. It's not just Monica, because Monica, of course, everybody will say, well, she was consensual, it was willing. In fact, she was in some ways the provocateur. She raised her thong, all that kind of stuff, and that's true. But I think that today we look at that a little different. He was a person of ultimate power. And even if she was consensual, she was 22 years old, and there is something very imbalanced about that. There's no question that we would look at a person in his position today taking advantage of that position to obtain personal gratification in a different way. And then you add the other allegers, victims he's had over the years who have alleged various things by him. Paula Jones, Kathleen Willey, and particularly Juanita Broaddrick, alleged things that are not at all consensual. And they're very much in keeping with the things that we have been focused on as a country in the last 2 years. Certainly would be considered to be sexual assault. And there is this moment, those three women have been reevaluated to some extent, and their allegations have been reevaluated. And even, of course, Kristen Gillibrand, who's running for president and holds Hillary Clinton's seat in the Senate today, says that in hindsight, Bill Clinton should have resigned. And I don't know whether he would have necessarily survived today. Having said that, we have a president today who has been accused of various things. And he is, in fact, still president, and he has not been forced out. In fact, he was elected even after some of these allegations had been made. So the counterfactual is hard to say.
Well, go ahead, Jeffrey.
I was going to say, that point's really important because it really shows how far we've come, not only from Bill Clinton, but also Gary Hart to the present situation, where the raging debate over President Trump's, one of his many dalliances, is not whether or not he had sexual relations with an adult film star. It was which bank account did they pay for it out of.
Right.
No one's disputing, really, the fact that he did something that in previous iterations of the presidency would easily have led to removal from office, or at least would have been a scandal far beyond the question of campaign finance.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Although, just for the fairness, for the record, he doesn't officially deny that he did anything with her. But it's interesting because you could look at that. Put aside Russia for a second and put aside obstruction of justice. The allegation.
Besides that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. That's your official.
Welcome to our dork encounter group.
This is John's official 2 Lincoln joke limit, right? You've now used them up. But the allegation against President Trump is that he violated the law to cover up sexual indiscretion. What do we accuse Bill Clinton of? Is violating the law to cover up sexual indiscretion. Now, they're somewhat different. It's a campaign finance law, but in essence, that's at the heart of that. In this day and age, obviously, there are a few other issues also on the table.
We currently have a president in the White House who's been the subject of impeachment conversations at least since right after Michael Flynn left. How unusual is that in the course of American history that serious conversations have been taking place for this much of a president's first term?
Unprecedented. Never, even before, from the day he was elected, you had people from the very day he was elected talking about whether they could impeach him or not. We've never had that happen, obviously. Now, Johnson is the closest in the sense that there was never any kind of, but he was elected. Trump was elected. Johnson was not. And therefore, always going to be seen as illegitimate by Lincoln's partisans. Trump won. However unfair people might feel about that, he did. And so to begin talking about impeachment from the very start shows how differently we think about that process and how differently we think about this president.
Well, there's been a lot of damning reporting, but we haven't seen the Mueller report yet. How much of the ire over Trump is political and how much of it is motivated by evidence that's been reported by journalists?
Well, that's a great question. Of course, what his partisans would tell you is this, obviously the witch hunt has been, used to death. But what they always say is, look, people are out to get him, and that they are interpreting every action through the most sinister and most suspicious light, and it is a political plot. And some of them, I'm sure, actually believe that, and some of them may be looking at that as a strategy for defending him. Either way, the Clinton example shows that a partisan impeachment, or impeachment that is perceived to be partisan, doesn't work. What Tim just talked about Republicans abandoning Nixon, if the president's own party sticks with him or her, they will not be impeached. And there is both, I think, a genuine belief on the part of a lot of people that Trump has been targeted unfairly by the fake news media, by the prosecutors and so on, and by the FBI. And even those who don't necessarily believe that understand that it's a good strategy.
I wanted to add that there was no real analogy or no parallel for Devin Nunes in the Nixon story. You did not have, now, the Democrats were in charge of both houses of Congress, that's true, but you had very prominent Republicans who participated in the Senate Watergate committee hearings. One of the huge differences between those two eras is that by this point in the Nixon scandal, we would have all had the opportunity independently to listen to testimony, no tapes, but to listen to testimony and to see documents that disturbed a lot of Americans regardless of party. So already each of us would have had the opportunity to be, to some extent, a juror because of the Senate Watergate Committee. Now, the Senate Watergate Committee was a bipartisan committee. Yes, it was run by Sam Erwin, but he had Howard Baker as his number two, and they both got almost equal time. And Republicans were not leaving the chamber saying this is a witch hunt. They were not saying to Americans, don't listen to what this committee is saying, and everything they're talking about is made up. That didn't happen. So the American people got a base of documents and fact to chew over. Now, that doesn't mean we were all going to agree, but we had a baseline of fact. We don't in this instance. And that is one of the, and we'll see when the Mueller report in its redacted form comes out. Well, actually, I'll explain to you, and I'm not involved in the process. I can tell you one reason I assume it's going to be redacted. And this is really important. I'm not going to take a side on Mr. McCabe, but I suspect he was a public servant. The reason why the FBI, which those of you who know something about the history of FBI, you know it's not a partisan organization, but it has been used by presidents politically, both on the left and the right. Johnson used it politically.
Nixon, and by its director.
But here's the thing. Why were they so nervous when James Comey was fired? Well, you don't need a security clearance to understand. You just go to something called the Intelligence Committee's assessment of the Russian intervention in our 2016 campaign. Adjectives matter a lot in the intelligence community. The FBI and the CIA had high confidence that Putin not only intervened in the election to mess things up and have us start to doubt our democratic institutions, but to help Donald Trump get elected. So in the FBI, they had high confidence. Now, we don't know the reason or the evidence, but they had high confidence. And then you have this man fire the head of the FBI. So now, I suspect the Mueller report will include some of the data that gave the FBI and others high confidence that Russia had a favorite in the election. And I think because we're still spying on Russia, that stuff can't be declassified yet. I would like it to be declassified, but I have a feeling, knowing something about how materials get released or don't get released, that will not be withheld because we don't want Putin to know how we know for sure that he actually made the call.
The difference, I would say, real quickly, is Tim's right. We haven't seen the evidence that Mueller is going to present. We hope to see most of it at least at some point. One thing we have seen that we didn't see in Nixon for the first umpteen months is that Trump basically tells us out loud, through Twitter, all the things that Nixon said on the tapes quietly. Imagine, no, I'm serious. I mean,
Yes.
like, he's very open. He says the Justice Department shouldn't be investigating this. This is outrageous. This is a witch hunt. They should be going after my opponents. They should be, he says out loud all these. In fact, this is part of their defense against obstruction of justice is, it's not obstruction because he's telling you this.
Yes, but there's one difference. Nixon did all that, and he also ordered obstruction of justice.
Yes.
What Donald Trump has not admitted publicly
Is actually an
actually
order.
because his argument publicly is, I'm innocent.
Yes.
These people, it's a witch hunt, it's unfair. I want it to stop because I'm innocent. Richard Nixon was guilty on the tapes.
Right. And we don't know if there are any tapes this time. Or emails.
Or emails or what have you.
So let's imagine the Mueller report comes out and is redacted only in the most sensitive areas. So it drops and it's available to the American public. How much does any of you think it might contain that will surprise people after all the reporting that has been done? I mean, you can have followed, the larger newspapers in this country and have a great deal of information about the kinds of things that the Mueller team is investigating. Has all that reporting been almost a safety valve so that people won't be so surprised by revelations that might be in the Mueller report?
I think it's like an iceberg. Mueller's the best coiffed iceberg you can imagine. I think we've seen the top, but I don't think we have any idea what he's doing. I know this. It's like the old joke about 60 Minutes in the 1970s. If you were a CEO, you knew it was going to be a bad week when Mike Wallace called you on Monday.
Yeah.
Bob Mueller starts investigating you, and your CFO and your lawyer are cooperating. Jesus. And I mean this totally sincerely. Peter Baker is the best in the arena and is, and is performing a remarkable civic function by standing up and being called an enemy of the people.
That part's true.
Well, that part is true. But to stand there, this is a difficult time for people who do what Peter does. The President of the United States is making it. The President of the United States is creating a climate of anxiety, fear, and hostility toward people who are simply trying to do what Jefferson wanted us to do, which was to debate, find a decision, whatever that might be, but there had to be a free exchange of ideas. For all that work, I think that this investigation is so wide-ranging, and it's just what Don Rumsfeld would call known unknowns. I can't speculate, but if anything, I would speculate there are elements, characters that we've never heard of. And the fear, to go to Tim's point, is going to be that when this appears in Peter's newspaper and online, will the country accept it as dispassionate fact and then make a decision? Or is that 35 to 40% of the country that will follow him anywhere going to say this is the document to a witch hunt, it's fake, it's artificial? And,
Peter, what do you think?
That's a great...
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that except for the nice things you said about me. Because in fact, actually, I'm a terrible reporter. Robert Mueller has been the most leak-proof government operation I've ever seen. He really is, and I say that with great frustration. But it also means that John may be right, that he may know so much more than we have. We may not have a clue what he knows. But so we're guessing. We're really guessing here. He has shown a small bit of his hand, I think. Almost all of the prosecution he has brought so far against Americans have, for the most part, been of the obstruction justice category, with the exception of Manafort's financial issues. He has not yet charged anybody with anything that would amount to collusion. Now, is that because he hasn't found it, or because he's holding it all back and he's going to lay out a big case and he's going to let the Congress decide? I don't know. The truth of the matter is, and we've done this a couple times in the paper, is when you sit down and you try to pull together all the disparate things we do know in public, because as you say, there has been a lot of reporting, and you pull it together all in one place, in one article, one long article, unfortunately, sometimes, it can be rather extensive and extraordinary what's already known, and yet has been to some extent discounted by a lot of the public. Okay, well, da-da-da-da. So the question is, does Robert Mueller come out with something that not only adds to our knowledge, but is so definitive and so damning that it does move the needle, that it does change the dynamics, Because right now, on Capitol Hill at least, there's no Republican mood for impeachment. There's zero, appetite for that. And the question is, how do you move 20 Republican senators? Because if you don't move 20 Republican senators, there's no point.
Well, and I think this is really a much bigger issue than just whether or not the president should be impeached or enjoy the last 2 odd years of his administration first term. Because if it comes out that there is a lot of evidence that is in a previous era generally understood to be factually true, and it's not that Americans today decide that they don't like the evidence, but that they don't believe the evidence to actually exist truthfully, I think that's a fundamental question for what we're going to do going forward. I mean, I go back, this is one of the things I take from Nixon. As Tim shows us beautifully in the chapter of the book, which you should all buy, that what really sinks Nixon, among other things, is that the American people can hear him on the tapes and they recognize the voice and they believe the tapes are true. I've seen a lot of Photoshop stuff in the last couple of years. I saw a great speech by President Obama the other day that he didn't give, but is pieced together. So what portion of the American, what could we possibly come up with that a portion of the American people wouldn't say, not that I disagree with the person who's bringing it to me, but that is simply not true what I'm seeing with my own eyes?
And let me add one more bar, which is that a number of the president's defenders, I'm talking about Nixon, in the summer of '74, who listened to those tapes, kept saying, okay, he's talking about hush money, but did he ever pay it? Because if he didn't pay, it's not a crime. And then they went on to say, also, we don't impeach presidents because they have bad lieutenants. There's no doubt Haldeman's a bad guy, Ehrlichman's a bad guy, John Dean's a bad guy. These are all bad guys. But impeachment's about the president. You have to prove to me the president ordered something bad, which raises the bar because you have to prove it. And what's interesting to me is that what kind of evidence, given that President Trump does not send emails, we don't know if he tends to write anything. I thought I said that delicately.
It was.
And unless Omarosa and Cohen have surreptitiously taped him, would you be able to have the evidence of direct presidential responsibility for crimes?
Right. That would be persuasive to the public.
Persuasive, because again, with Nixon gave us the rope, right? Nixon's tapes did it. They proved beyond a shadow of the doubt that he himself had participated in a cover-up. What kind of evidence would the American people need now to accept that Donald Trump wanted his campaign to find out what WikiLeaks was up to and didn't care that WikiLeaks might be associated with the Russians?
So we're about out of time, but I want to ask if any one of you can conceive of Donald Trump, as we know him, stepping down in the face of impeachment proceedings.
I'm going to quote Peter Baker, who
Go Lincoln.
in December
Go back to Lincoln.
of December 17, you all did one of this long stories you're talking about Trump's daily life, right? And you all quoted someone saying that Trump had said during the transition to the staff, I want to treat every day of the presidency as an episode of a TV show in which I vanquish my rivals, right?
Yeah.
So no.
If I could extend on that, that's
Can
not,
you quote Peter Baker?
I know I don't.
That's the next volume.
The Baker tapes.
The essential Baker.
What really worries me is that the Constitution is relatively clear enough to my mind, on how you impeach and convict a president. There's nothing in the Constitution about how you actually physically remove him from the Oval Office. No, I'm serious. And think about this scenario.
6 pounds.
Yeah. But think about this scenario. The president gets impeached and convicted. He is in the White House. He is tweeting to his followers, they are trying to take away your president. They are trying to nullify your election. And here's an interesting fact. His followers tend to be heavily armed. So all it takes is 15,000 of them to show up in Washington, D.C. heavily armed, and you get something much, much worse than Tiananmen Square.
The Secretary of Defense, Nixon Secretary of Defense, told us at the library that he was so concerned that someone in the White House would order a troop movement. He didn't think it would be Nixon. He knew Nixon well enough. Nixon always had other people to do these things outside of the inner circle. That he made clear to the chain of command that unless you hear the voice of the President of the United States, you may not move troops. That's how nervous the Pentagon was that Richard Nixon would hang on to power. And after the Supreme Court unanimously found that the President had to turn over tapes relevant to criminal proceedings, Richard Nixon did not want to obey the Supreme Court initially. It took 7 hours, and we don't really know how ultimately he was prevailed upon. I believe Al Haig, I write in the book, Al Haig defected to the Union at that point. But I think Al Haig, but the President did not want to obey the Supreme Court. Because we have a separation of powers, there are opportunities for presidents to say no. Fortunately for us in 1974, Richard Nixon saw the writing on the wall and ultimately left. But who knows what this president would do if faced with a similar situation.
I have hours more questions, but we'll need to leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, these gentlemen need to get through the room and back to where they're going to be signing books. So if you all would just stay in your seats until they have exited the auditorium, that way we can facilitate them signing all your books for you. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Baker, it is an honor and a privilege.
Thank you. So good to see you.
You too. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
You were great. That
You
was
were
fun.
great too.